as Doug Smart says, we want to reward the people that arrived on time, not the ones that are confused about parking. My name is Jane Harding, and I'm the Financial Development Officer for BC Conference, working in the BC region. And it is my pleasure as the President of the Stewardship Team here in British Columbia to welcome you to Inspired to Act. We are going to be, and along with the Justice, what is it, Mariana? Advisory Circle. Justice Advisory Circle. We're in partnership with this free conference event, and we're just so pleased that you're all here. My sense is folks will come in, and we will just welcome them. So quickly, I'm just going to say that we will be together for an hour and a half, or a day and a half, more than an hour and a half. And we're going to start with some introductions, and we'll get started with
my PowerPoint person.
Oh,
No, I can do it, right? I can do it.
thanks, Brenda.
So there's 2 pages of me.
That's great. Come on in, sit down, relax.
Just hit the.
I'll be the one. Our God breathes new life into hopeless situations. Loving God.
Breathe your Spirit into us and make us new.
Our God offers forgiveness to all who have done wrong. Loving God.
Breathe your Spirit into us and make us new.
Our God longs to be part of us, to live within us. Loving God.
Breathe your Spirit into us and make us new.
Our God untangles the chaos of our lives and sets us free to new life. Loving God.
Breathe your Spirit into us and make us new.
Come, let us worship the God of resurrection, of new life, of new hope.
Amen.
Let's take a big breath in, and we're going to sing together. Ready?
You are holy.
You.
Some water. Just go back to the.
Fingers. I didn't realize usually them.
You want to stand to sing? How do we do that? I just figured out a new app on my phone that measures my steps.
So do you?
Yeah, I'm going to try and trick it.
Steps.
What trick?
I have a big
Okay.
Hit from the feet. And slideshow. Up in the left-hand corner.
Here we
Here we
go.
go.
scripture reading today is Matthew 25:34-40. I was hungry, from the message. Then the king will say to those on his right, enter, you are blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you in this kingdom. It's been ready since the world's foundation. And here's why. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was homeless and you gave me a room. I was shivering and you gave me clothes. I was sick and you stopped to visit. I was in prison and you came to me. Then those sheep are going to say, Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you? Then the king will say, I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me.
I want to share with you a poem. It's out of the May mandate, Prophets in the House, a mandate which also features Kofi. And it's by Mitchell Anderson, who says that he follows Jesus along the banks of the South Saskatchewan River. And it's called A Whispering Voice. In a world that shouts more, seducing us and selling us empty visions, stealing our imaginations with endless dreams of stuff. In that world, a prophet is she who whispers, enough. In a world where the voice of Jesus says yes, yes to the victory of life over death, yes to hope that vanquishes fear, yes to resurrection. In that world, a prophet is he who says no. No to death, division, and hatred. No to despair. I hear prophets all around me as they proudly declare hope. They are preachers and they are poets. I hear prophets all around me, and I smile and I greet them friends.
So let's take a deep breath. Let's feel our feet on the ground, our backs against the chair, and feel that air oxygenating all of who we are. And let us pray. Gracious God, thank you for being here today, right now, with your all-encompassing love and compassion. As we embark on this journey, we ask you to come along to open our ears to hear the truth. Open our eyes to see new ways of being. Open our hearts to the hurts and injustice in the world, and to the hope and passion that can move us. Inspire in us a vision where we see you in every face that we meet, and we respond mirroring your love and the actions of your Son, Jesus, to help heal all the shattered and torn parts of creation. We remember and bring to you those who need your healing presence. We remember and bring ourselves, always in the need of your love, to be open to your Spirit. Thank you for those who are providing leadership in our time together: Kofi, Claire, Jill, Sally, Vivian, Karen, Adrian. As always, we are bold to ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. And let's sing again. Not everybody knows this one, but I think you'll figure. Do you want to play it through once?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Stand? Stand.
God said, "Be still, so you may hear the words I whisper in your ear. If you will listen, you will know I am your
nice to gather our hearts together and start thinking and feeling the spirit around our work today. So I would like to have little introductions first. Everyone who's on the Justice Advisory Council or the BC Stewardship Team, please stand up. So these folks have been working since last November to bring this event to you because it's important and because we believe in partnership. And how awesome is it to gather people with a stewardship passion and a justice passion and put them together in the same room. So thank you, all of you. Wonderful. And grateful to the staff that are here today too, helping us set up and organize. And I would like to just run down a little bit of our time together today. There's coffee out there. I believe they'll replenish it as we go. And I saw cookies, so that's awesome. There's lots of water, which we always really like. Washrooms, little housekeeping, for those of you who haven't found them yet, kind of straight out the way you came, there's a spiral staircase there, and they're just in behind the staircase. So a little bit of walk to do that. I believe we're recording today, are we not? We are recording? Jace, and so keep the profanity to a minimum. I guess that was for me. So we're going to welcome Kofi. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction in a moment. After Kofi speaks this morning and we've had a little time to digest and do some work, you're having lunch on your own. There are all kinds of places here. I don't know if you've noticed. If you even go out in the plaza, there's lots of places. On the parking lot, there's fast places, there's Subway, there's sushi, there's all kinds of stuff. And so enjoy and take that hour to do a little digesting, because this afternoon we're going to come together. You may have noticed those giant things in the corner. That's sort of the underpinnings of the creative work that we're going to do this afternoon as we think about and feel the spirit and create. So that's going to be very exciting, a community art project for us to do together. Are there any questions? How are we doing? Everybody's okay? I always like to just check the tone because sometimes it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too bright, it's too dark. Everybody looks really good. Okay. So, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Kofi Hope to you. Kofi Hope is a Rhodes Scholar, a Doctor of Philosophy in Politics, a community activist, and a youth advocate. He has over 10 years of experience in managing community-based programs. In 2005, he founded the Black Youth Coalition Against Violence, a group which advocated for real solutions to the issue of gun violence. This advocacy work included a presentation for the then Prime Minister Paul Martin, and led to him being named one of the top 10 people to watch in Toronto in 2006 by the Toronto Star. Currently, he is the Managing Director of Community Empowering Enterprises, CEE, a nonprofit which creates economic opportunities for Black youth in Toronto. He has delivered over 60 speaking engagements in Canada and the UK, and was co-chair of Olivia Child's Election Advisory Committee in 2014. And on a personal note, our teams met with Kofi and his wife and his beautiful daughter Samira, who will be 3 on June 3rd, or 1 on June 3rd. And she is just a gift, so beautiful. And so now we know him to be caring and confident and humble and passionate and compassionate, loving, kind, and brilliant. We are in good hands. Hand it over to Kofi. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
God is good?
God is good.
God is good?
God is
Very good.
Excellent, yes. Great. And I'm going to start, of course, by giving thanks to the Most High for life. I want to give thanks for being able to be here with you on the other side of the continent. I want to give thanks for the beauty of creation as it exists in this place and its many other forms. And I also want to give thanks to BC Conference for inviting me to be here and be able to be in fellowship with you. And finally, give thanks and acknowledgement to the Squamish and Lillooet peoples who are the first inhabitants in this space. I also want to give kind of a wish of peace to all of you by reciting my favorite Hindu mantra, which goes as following. Loka samista sukhino bhavantu, which means, may all beings on all worlds be happy. And it's appropriate, of course, since we're living in this tiny blue planet in an almost limitless universe that God has created. And from the smallest organism to the great blue whale to beings living on the other side of the galaxy, we think, my wish is that we all live in harmony together in this universe that God has given us. Now, I want to take down from the cosmic level to the kind of nitty-gritty of our world. I want to take you back to a Saturday morning last November in Toronto, in a community of Rexdale, which has beautiful people, but certainly has some of its rougher parts. And those are the areas where our infamous former mayor, Rob Ford, got up to some of his shenanigans. And this day in November, I was in Rexdale at Humber College, doing a graduation for our program called Kitchen Masters. Now, Kitchen Masters is an amazing journey. We worked with that cohort with 11 young men and women who self-identified as Black and lived in so-called priority communities like Rexdale in Toronto. These are places where the subway doesn't go, where the news only comes to talk about crime and gangs, and where there's a lack of services and endemic over-policing. Now, these young people we worked with, we picked because they were out of school, they were out of work, and they faced barriers to employment. Barriers like having been incarcerated, having young families to take care of, having faced past traumas or abuse, maybe perhaps not having passed high school and had other struggles with formal education, maybe living in insecure housing, and for most of them facing the issue of poverty. Now, despite all of these barriers, we had an amazing, brilliant, articulate group of young people together who had a passion for cooking and building a career in the culinary field. And we took them on this kind of fabulous journey, which started at a United Church retreat center, Five Oaks, which is a favorite place of mine that we'd rented out for a weekend. And so we started doing some serious contemplation about the next steps in their journey and moving forward in life. And then we did cooking challenges, and then we brought in some chefs to talk to them. And then we followed that with life skills classes, time at a culinary school, coaching, exposure trips to different cultural restaurants, meetings with industry professionals, a chance to actually get local contracts and cook in community. Actually, Kitchen Masters cooked for the moderator when he came and visited us in Jane and Finch, and he was our special guest judge to tell them what he thought of, I think it was chili versus a Thai tom yum soup, and he refused to pick a winner, but he had a good time with them. Yeah. And so that's that kind of 6-month journey that the Kitchen Masters were on. So I'm there this Saturday morning at Humber College, and we're hosting the graduation for Kitchen Masters. And in the morning, people have got to do a cookout. They've got a great kind of master chef space. So they got to show off their skills in front of their families. And now they were assembling to get their certificates. And I was just looking over that group and feeling so proud. I saw one of the women there who'd talked to me just a couple of days before about how she hadn't graduated high school. And to her, this was like her high school graduation. And more than that, doing this was inspiring her to go back to school in the fall. So I'm feeling great about that. And I see another young woman. And, seeing her there, dressed up, ready to go, I couldn't help but think back to when she did the interview to get into the program. She was in a really difficult space at the time, living in precarious housing, had some challenging past years, and had just been reunited with her daughter. And when we asked her, why do you want to be in the program? She kind of looked down and then said, you know what? I just want to show my family it's possible to achieve something. That in her mind, none of her siblings had been able to do anything positive in life. And this was her chance by finishing this program to show them that. And she faced challenges during the program. One of those siblings, unfortunately, lost their lives to gun violence during the program. But she stuck with it through the thick and thin. She was one of the first to get a job placement in Regent Park at a social enterprise there. Was doing great in the placement, started taking care of her daughter, and it was just amazing to see her there, so excited and ready to go. So literally, we're about to open the door, step out, and suddenly there's a phone call. And one of my coworkers gets it, picks it up, just lets out a scream, and basically shoves the phone into my hand. And I pick it up, and it's a participant from our other program, from the entrepreneurship program. And they called me with tragic news that night, one of the members of our other programs had been shot and killed. Like that, everything changed. And it was crazy because I'd heard about that shooting on the news. And as I was driving, I thought, well, that's kind of in our rough area. Hope it isn't anyone I know. And unfortunately, it was. And so literally, as the kitchen masters walked out to get their certificates, I had to go into crisis mode, giving support to staff, to other participants, and drive off immediately to help those folks who were really being directly affected by this. And that began one of the hardest weeks, and in truth, one of the hardest months I've probably faced in my life. You know, just when we had that chance to celebrate victory, it was all washed away, and the harshness and ugliness that can accompany my work suddenly overwhelmed everything. You know, that young brother we lost was such a motivated soul. He'd been released after serving 3 years in jail. And for someone in their early 20s, 3 years is a long time. It's a long time for anyone. But he was the most engaged member of that program. And that's what jail can do to you. You know, sometimes it can bring out strange and negative qualities, but it can also give you a fire on release that, if it's properly channeled, can create real transformation. And as I was driving to the police station that morning from the graduation, I thought about the retreat we had done, not at Five Oaks, they were booked. But anyways, at another retreat center, and I thought of the way he, the entire time, kept coming to me with ideas. You know, ideas about the business he wanted to start, about how he could launch it, about what was needed, how he should organize it, what were the next steps. He got so eager that one night I just had to say, listen, man, it's 11 o'clock. We've been going for 10 hours. You know, there's a whole program ahead. We're going to answer all these questions. But I love the energy. 3 days before he was killed, he presented to his group his plan for his business. I wasn't there, but there's actually a video of it, and he got a standing ovation. He just blew away the group with his ideas and with his enthusiasm and passion. And then we lost him. A son, a brother, a friend, a child of God, shot 9 times and left to die in the road at 24 years old. And he was someone who truly wanted to change his life for the better, but he never got that opportunity. So last fall was very difficult for me. We lost this young man. Another young man who we were very close to in the program got deported, and it was a really messy process that we had to accompany him around that. And then, of course, there were the other struggles that I won't get into, but that all the young men and women were facing in the program. And on top of these issues, my organization was going through some of its own issues. We had major changes that had to be made. There was burnout from a lot of staff. There were the growing pains of being a startup organization doing incredibly difficult work. And sometimes I was wondering, you know, if I could keep going with it. You know, some days it was all I could muster to kind of get up, iron my pants, and get out the door to the office, and barely doing that. And during this time, and for the last couple of years since I've come back to Canada and been doing this work, you know, people always ask me, they'll kind of say, oh, that's interesting. So why are you doing that work? You know, you have an Oxford PhD. What inspires you to do that? And many times this is code for saying, well, why aren't you in some kind of cushy downtown job? Why are you working in these difficult neighborhoods? Why are you doing this youth work stuff? And when they ask about inspiration, that's actually the key to it. For during those difficult moments in the last year, if it wasn't for inspiration, I certainly would have left for a cushy job downtown. But it was that inspiration I got from the participants. Those days I didn't do the work I was supposed to be doing and showed up at the program and just felt the energy of a room full of people who were inspired to change their lives. It was from that inspiration from coworkers I saw who sacrificed time with their families, career opportunities, and even their health to make these programs work. And I can proudly say that we got through a difficult fall with the program. We did some organizational development, restructuring, and now by the summer, it's really summer for us because things are going well, it's great, and we're back to the point where most of us are psyched every day to come into the office. But this is the work. Social change work, community work, is not easy. It's mentally, physically, and spiritually exhausting. And one needs constant inspiration in order to keep at it. So when we think about the theme for this event that we're at, Inspired to Act, it's a big topic. But I think we're talking a lot more than just inspiring words or even inspiring experiences. You know, we'll get that over the next couple of days for sure. And you get that at all conferences. You know, all these amazing people that are gathered, you know, with the same vision coming together. Hopefully you'll have some half-decent speakers. There'll be a chance to connect, to recharge. You know, usually people come away from conferences and events like this really pumped. You know, you're riding on that post-conference buzz. Then you go back to the real world, and within a week or two, or a day or two, maybe even less, that shine wears off, and you're back to where you were, just struggling to put one foot in front of the other. So, conferences and events are great to give that spark. But what I want to talk about is what is that inspiration that keeps you acting in the long term. And I will argue today that inspiration to act, true inspiration, comes from relationships and comes from communities. For my PhD thesis, one of the things I got to do was interview anti-apartheid activists, including many who were part of the United Church. I did about 90 interviews in South Africa and in Canada for it. So a great opportunity. One of the people I spent a lot of time chatting to is now a good friend of mine, Jim Kirkwood. He's about 83 years old. He led the Africa desk at the United Church head office for many years, from the 70s into the 1990s. And Jim spoke at length about the tough times when they were doing that anti-apartheid work. Back when Nelson Mandela was not seen as someone you name a road or a school after, when he was a terrorist, when supporting the ANC meant you were a terrorist sympathizer, that you must be a secret communist. And he said, Kofi, the key was our community. Because it's almost impossible to keep hope alive when you're trying to make change on your own. But hope lives in community. So what we're really talking about when we say inspired to act is the inspiration of a community that supports action, that provides a theory and a narrative to bind together its members and then supports its members as they struggle together. And I would offer that religious communities are best poised to offer this space. Now, most of my professional work has been in the secular world, in secular spaces. And for those of you who've done work in that sector, you'll know social service work is hard, and there is lots of burnout. And many times there aren't all the resources there to keep people inspired or to keep them working. And when I've been in those contexts, many times I've pulled on practices I learned in the United Church, like retreats, like meditative practices, like ritualized action, to keep my team motivated. And these practices, when put to use, are some of the best that exist for keeping people inspired and working. So at our churches and communities of faith, we have, at our base, some of the key tools, that whole toolbox to motivate citizens to change the world. And that was my experience in my own life. As a high school student, struggling to fit in and trying to find my own way, facing a lot of pressures to conform, sometimes not always running with the best influences, it was my church youth group that was one of the spaces that kept me grounded. It kept me inspired to do things like volunteer and give back, even when I was too embarrassed to talk about that stuff at school with my friends. It was the community of folks that I worked with at our church youth outreach program, a program that created safe spaces for youth from social housing in our community. That was the community that gave me the inspiration to start a career in the social change field that I'm still in today. And when I went to university, it was a community of young, progressive black men and women who were part of the student movement that really inspired me to further action. As a young black man growing up in Western society, there's lots of stereotypes and negative images around you, and many you can internalize, and many, unfortunately, can pull you in the wrong direction. But when I went to university, I met a community that was committed to resisting those stereotypes and making a positive change. And when we talk about some of the activist work I did there, it was because of this community that had inspired me to grow a lot and had really pushed me to challenge even the ways I was participating in oppressions like sexism or homophobia. And then when 2006 hit and this so-called Summer of the Gun was going on in Toronto, it was that community I was able to pull on and work with to create this coalition of black student groups and allies across the city that spoke out with a community response to what was happening in the city. And that work went on for 3 years, and as was mentioned, one of the highlights was getting to speak to Paul Martin and make a presentation about what real solutions would look like to the issue of gun violence. But throughout that whole campaign, there were ups and there were downs, but it was that community that was there struggling with me, staying up till midnight, day after day, doing planning meetings, taking strategy phone calls at any time, showing up for rallies and deputations on the weekend. That was the community that sustained me and the work. So, as Jim said, it is in communities that hope grows, and from that, social action takes form. But the question we must ask ourselves is, do our churches, do our congregations serve that role today? I'll say sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And many times, when it comes to controversial, decisive, and risky action, they fail. So to illustrate this, let me paint another scene. I'm just going to grab some water and continue. So the scene is a jail cell. The date is April 16th, 1963. And in that cell in Birmingham, Alabama, sits a man, just 34 years old. He's actually about a year older than I am now. But at 34, his words had already begun to shake the foundations of the world's most powerful nation. And his name, of course, was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he sat in that cell, probably with not the best lighting, probably not the best smells or conditions or environment, and he penned one of his most famous letters, the letter from a Birmingham jail. Has anyone here read that letter? Good. It's great. And I would suggest for everyone it's available widely online. And for me, Dr. King's writings are the most exquisite articulation we have in modern times of what it means to be a progressive, socially justice-grounded Christian. And there's no better model if we're thinking about inspiration for action than Dr. King, who was one of the most inspiring orators of the last century, but also a great organizer, strategist, and campaigner. He was not a perfect man, but he was someone who greatly exemplifies that mix of faith and action. Now, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, King writes to the church, to what would be called the white moderate or the mainline church. And I was rereading the letter in preparation for this talk, and it's amazing how pertinent it is today. When he speaks about police brutality in Birmingham, I of course thought of what's going on today in the States, in Ferguson and Baltimore, the whole Black Lives Matter campaign. And I also even thought about Toronto, where evidence has shown widespread, embedded racial profiling and discrimination in our police service against people who are Black, Brown, and First Nation. As an example, one of the places I work is a community called Jane and Finch in the northwest side of Toronto. And I did a small community roundtable last year when I was working with Olivia, and she came up and was talking to different community members. And one of them was a young Black man, about 19, student, and he spoke to the group about an experience he'd had a few months back, where it was a nice summer day, and he was walking to the store to buy something, I think like a drink, and he told us that in that time between going from his building to the store, he was stopped 5 times by the police in one journey up the street. So the power of the letter from a Birmingham jail is not just the timelessness of King's words, but also the way they have continued relevance and highlight how our society still fails to heed his message 50 years later. But of equal relevance to his cry against racial injustice is his forceful rebuttal of the mainline church of his day. So again, for those who haven't read the letter, King wrote it because he was deeply hurt by the fact that within those weeks of the campaign, a group of white clergy had written a public letter denouncing him for the organizing he was doing. These ministers accused him of shaking things up unnecessarily, of causing violence and chaos, of being too impatient for change, and actually hurting the cause. And so King, in his rebuttal, questions the very purpose of the Christian church. And he starkly lays out the challenge for the church when it comes to being a place for action or social justice. I'll let Dr. King's words speak for themselves. And so he writes, "I love the church. How could I do otherwise? I'm in the rather unique position of being the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ. But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being non-conformist. There was a time when the church was very powerful. In the early time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the morals of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. But things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffective voice with an uncertain sound. So often is an arch defender of the status quo, Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often even vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture that sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Forceful, challenging words. A little uncomfortable, aren't they? Well, and for me, that's the point. For I truly believe a little bit of discomfort is the spark that can set off learning and self-discovery. Now, one thing I love about this section of the text is that he talks about the church's fear of being nonconformist. Now, this was part of King's writings. He talked a lot about this idea of being maladjusted. Now, that's an old kind of psychology term that's a bit outdated, but the point remains that an activist and a truly empathetic and faithful person has to be maladjusted to modern society. There is no other option in a world of discrimination, war, poverty, environmental destruction, and obscene consumerism than to be anything but maladjusted. That to be happily at peace with the world as it is wrong. For remember, that charismatic faith healer and preacher from that no-good backwater of Nazareth, the one we call Messiah, had one thing at the heart of his mission: the kingdom or the dominion of God. And that dominion that Jesus preached about is the gold standard for what society should look like. It's a place where justice reigns, where the hungry are fed, the naked are clothed, the sick are healed, and freedom reigns. And if this dominion is our ultimate goal as Christians, then we have to be maladjusted to society. As King says, we have to be the thermostat and not the thermometer. But as he points out, the church in the Western world became part of the power structure. It became the official religion of Rome, and for 1700 odd years was part and parcel of the status quo. And it's hard to be that community that inspires action when you're a community that simply reflects back the values of society and the values and beliefs of the powerful and privileged. But as we all also know, throughout history, there have been Christians in the church and outside of it who have spoken to power. There were the Christians at the heart of the movement to end slavery, the Christians who fought for women's suffrage, who fought for civil rights, who fought against internment camps for Japanese Canadians, who fought for an end to apartheid, who fought against nuclear weapons, and the Christians who, if you look at it, founded pretty much every single nonprofit organization that exists in the West today. That's our legacy. And these groups of Christians still exist within the United Church, and I know amazing justice-focused Christians are here in the room today. But as a whole, as a denomination, we are still challenged by this call to be a thermostat and not a thermometer, to inspire people to confront what's wrong about society, and even more so, to confront how they're actually playing an active role in what's wrong in society. That's an uncomfortable and a challenging church, but those are the churches people are committed to. You know, this hit home recently when I was reading an article on the BBC website. They're having a debate about the fact that there's been this massive surge in the last 10 years, a 7% increase of Americans who say they're no longer part of any religion. And there's also been a growth in atheism, but for the most part, this growth is of people who used to be Christians, who are now kind of free agents, as it was. Still spiritual, but not connected to any faith. And so there's a debate between different intellectuals on why. And one reason that was agreed to by both the conservative and progressive voices was that a major driving trend in the last 10 years was the fact that Christianity in America, especially evangelical churches, have been more and more associated with spreading hatred towards our gay, lesbian, and trans brothers and sisters. But as someone then noted in the same article, well, yeah, but the mainline churches are losing folks even faster than the evangelical ones. So while the evangelical churches are losing lots of folks due to their opposition to gay rights, those individuals don't then leave and go to mainline churches. They're just choosing to opt out. And this conundrum has been debated within this church for a while. Why is it that even though the values of the United Church match the values of Canadians, we have all the surveys and the data to show it, Canadians, especially young people, don't feel much desire to be part of the church? And well, there are multiple reasons for this, but one is the fact people are not drawn to thermometers. If the church is simply in lockstep view with popular opinion of secular society, then the church is just another social club. Scholars of religion say this quite clearly, that religions are successful when they create a collective identity, when people feel they are a part of something unique and something different. So whether it's ultra-Orthodox movements or religious revival movements or progressive movements like the civil rights movement, they all have in common that they gave people an identity that was different than the mainstream, that was maladjusted to mainstream culture and says, we see the world as it is, as a place in need of change, and in this space, in this community, we will do something different. It's those communities that inspire. Now, what I'm saying is not that new, but here's where I'll divert, because, hang out with lots of justice folks in the United Church, and they jump on this stuff and say, aha, so if we're just more radical and more political, if we're just far ahead of mainstream Canadian opinion on all these social issues, then people will get excited. And so I have friends who say, well, if we just had a carbon tax in the church, and we have more radical inclusion of LGBTQ peoples, if we, just fund even more radical activists overseas, that's going to fix everything. To that, I'd have two responses. One, generally, yes, we must be conscious, to be that thermostat, and it's more compelling than the thermometer, as King has said. But, issues we fight on can't originate from that understanding. They can't originate from a political calculation of how do we inspire more people to join us. They need to really come from a place of faith, from empathy, from ethics, and discipleship to that vision of a kingdom. But more importantly, as Jesus said, human beings do not live on bread alone, and very few people live on politics alone. If the church has amazing politics, that's great, but so do secular groups. That still won't be enough to keep people. So, yes, the church has to put together inspiring and daring stances on issues of social justice, but then this has to be paired with deep spiritual experiences, inspiring and engaging worship, and a strong community that put faith and acts at its heart. It has to inspire not just intellectually, but emotionally and spiritually. It has to have worship, rituals, and practice that sustain people in action. And I think it's rare we have that all together. But now, as many congregations are in decline in many parts of the country, and certainly the denomination as a whole is shrinking, I actually believe this is a great time to experiment. It's only when things are challenging that you're pushed to change, to grow, and to evolve. And we need to embrace that and in the process create new and inspiring forms of Christian community. And there are lots of places to start, especially in our own tradition. As King notes, there's much to be admired in the early church. And we can be honest, the early Christians and what they saw as church, or the early disciples and what they saw as church, is very different than what we do today. And, when you read about it, the Gospels talk about how the early Christians lived communally with a sharing of everything they had. We know that they were outsiders. They weren't afraid to break social norms and taboos. And they were filled with a zeal to change society and bring about the kingdom, even if it meant dying for it. And I recently read the book Zealot by Reza Aslan. Has anyone read that book? Yeah, it's a good read. Yeah, I didn't read it, I'm lying. I listened to the audio book while driving to work in the morning, but great listen either way. And one of the interesting things to me about that text was when they talked about this guy, James the Just. James, the brother of Jesus, who was head of the early church in Jerusalem. Now, I realized then when I was hearing this that I'd never heard about James during my years in the United Church. And actually I realized I didn't really learn much about the early Christians. And that's stuff that mainly came up from much later. And what we know about James, the Lord's brother, was he was killed in 62 AD by a high priest in an execution that was quite scandalous because he was quite well loved in Jerusalem. And we also know that that church and much of its legacy died with the members when the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so that kind of approach to Christianity kind of forcefully ended. And it was Paul and his kind of Hellenistic version of church that won out in the end. And the Gospels make it quite clear, though, that up to 70, there was a big split in the Christian movement between James and the church in Jerusalem and their understanding of Christianity, and Paul and the larger church outside of the land of Israel. And we know that the Jerusalem church really saw itself as being a Jewish movement, though there seems to have been more and more openness to letting Gentiles in, and we know there's esoteric debates about circumcision and that kind of stuff that was very important at the time. But it was really about this question of, who is Christian and what does it mean and where does it connect to Judaism? And not obviously, but it's there that there was also differences in their views around the divinity of Christ and their theology. I don't really have the academic chops or the time to discuss that, but I think it's quite interesting. But what's interesting for me is this. It's probably fair to assume that James knew his own brother's message a little bit better than Paul, who'd never met the guy. And it seems that James's message is much more about social change than Paul's was. And you can just read the Epistle of James, which people think James wrote, and people here who are theology PhDs or experts might know whether he really wrote it, but many consensus is he did. And you can look at that and Paul's, and you can see the difference. And when I was reading James, because I got really inspired after hearing that book to go and read that epistle, which I'd never had, to be honest, I saw in it that James, just like Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, speaks without hesitation about his opposition to a society where the rich continue to grow rich and the poor remain poor. His words then, probably next to the Gospels, are the best source we have for understanding what Jesus and his original movement were all about. And so let me share a couple passages from those words of James, from the Epistle of James. One piece. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this: to care for orphans and widows in distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Later he says, my brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while to the poor one you say, stand there, or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions amongst yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to Scripture. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And later his anger at the rich continues, where he says, come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. And famously he says, this is the one that was very familiar to me, so faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. This is a gospel of action, also of moral purity, but a gospel that is centered around social justice. And it's one that speaks to social upheaval, social change, and a little bit of controversy, I would say. And these are the messages of the original Christians. Before such verses were stripped of their revolutionary message and turned into just nice metaphorical images. This is the message, it seems, that was being preached immediately after Jesus' death by those who knew him most. This was the language of a movement that was certainly not a thermometer of contemporary society, but a bunch of maladjusted individuals who said, this society has to change. God demands it. And they clearly said wealth inequality and the oppression of the rich over the poor has to stop. And it was this mission that drove Jesus to overturn the money changers' tables, to rage against the temple aristocrats and Hellenized Jewish elites who collaborated with the Roman occupation and enriched themselves off the backs of the poor. And this was the call at the heart of this message of a new kingdom, which would be on earth as it is in heaven. And it was a call continued by his brother James, who was described as being a true religious zealot of sorts, who did not cut his hair or bathe, but dedicated his life to campaigning for the poor, whose knees were said to be calloused from the hours he spent in prayer, and was so righteous and honorable, it seems that the same religious officials who'd killed Jesus were open to him continuing to preach even in the temple. And like his brother and John the Baptist, Jesus' mentor, these individuals and the men and women who followed them were a community bound by a commitment to transform themselves and their society to be in line with the Word of God. So in many ways then, our challenge today is to innovate in how we are church and go back to these roots, to not be afraid to go against the grain, to speak for justice and live by righteousness, to say, yes, we've made much progress since that time, and it's great, but a world where 1.2 billion people still live in extreme poverty is not good enough. A world where our First Nations people face horrendous rates of poverty, suicide, and incarceration is not good enough. A world where the rich continue to, just be surrounded by splendor and live in opulence in places like Dubai, where millions work as virtual slaves to build those gleaming towers, that world is not good enough. This is not God's dominion. A Canada where our elderly are shut away in homes or left isolated and alone is not God's blessed community. A nation where working families struggle with debt and must work multiple temporary jobs without benefits to make bills meet, this is not good enough. And so, brothers and sisters, we can't be afraid to raise the heat a little. But to do so, we must build communities and practices to sustain that fire. And to do this means moving forward, but also looking back to our roots, to the inspiration of some of the earliest Christians to help inspire us in our future today. I'm going to pause now. I've talked enough for this point. And we'll come back and I'll continue. But I want to start now drawing on the wisdom in the room. I've put a few, seeds out there for you to think about. And now I want you to take maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes in your table groups to have a bit of a discussion. You can follow whatever direction you want, but my suggested discussion question is to start this at the personal. So share with the group, what was a person or community that has inspired you to act in the past? Share that story with the people around you. Yes. What is a person or community? Try to make it a community, but it may not be. That has inspired you to act in the past. Share that story.
something you cash, each term, you know, they,
Write the check.
yeah, 50, yeah. And many of the paths they work help set up is so it's something to take care of.
Well, that's like the parents.
Yes.
You use the parents to make them look right.
Well, to deliver service and people that also allow us to deal with that organization for their $550 million to eradicate.
Pretty close.
You seem to be going in a circle.
Just a waiting
Person in community, so is it church community?
Someone came and asked because it was, we have an amplifier in our process that's owned right, that they must be park. And that's supposed to be part of the so it's about money. And so that's right there, never really got through the other side. And what's the role and stuff. Yeah, and we also have stuff there. So we have their all where this one section, yeah.
Very well. So it's a great time.
So we don't have generous people there?
Well, you don't know on the surface.
On the surface, there's those people down there, they're very well. They hardly make it. So we're sort of fragmented, so a lot of values. Oh, and a lot more help or more in the central location. It's difficult, that number of, but I think
Kofi was talking about sort of hope within the community. Without that community, rainwater harvesting.
You know, I guess I was just like something inspired
My world for like 7 years.
the strongest thing I think.
For a while, but I'd like to send it back to me as well.
Yeah. And, but staying, because you learn it's all you is
And there was
and
times when I just got
that
really hard.
basis, that well that you go under, as just
when you work close to
other than
And even in that, which I tried to push,
which piece do you need? The main church belongs to the church.
community that I already know and love.
About just giving money to asking the street. He said that's more about you and letting go. And
It won't happen, but
while he was grabbing and ran off, and then I was kind of
I mean, I can't.
I was running very fast. I was like, am I going to kick this woman in the back and take my money back, or just have to stand here like an idiot and watch her run off? And then I kind of swore on it. I'm like, why would you give money to someone on the street? Yeah. And I'm like,
the visit that came to our conversation, she said, sister,
it's your fault.
I know that.
And since then, I just stopped cheating.
Can we, to bring my sister.
And it's a struggle to have I lowered my empathy down, or is it being
Dave does that. He inspires, he wants to be able to see us. We know well do things, but then my church
And it's both how I take on and it's how people.
individuals within the church does things. So it was, we as a church.
okay, folks, we're gonna just bring this
I can trust that.
thought to an end.
Because people are here.
I know. Okay,
Oh,
friends,
yeah, that's true.
I promise we will. Yeah. I promise we'll have more time to continue. Oh yeah, this thing. I promise we'll have more time to continue. And we'll have some more. We'll have another point during the talk to speak further, and then this afternoon. But it's great that conversation is so rich. Just for a minute, were there anyone who feels really inspired to very succinctly share something that came up in their table group that really has them thinking now?
Well, we kind of stopped in the middle of our conversation, so I'll mention that where we stopped, and it's to your point where you talked about,
You maybe stand.
okay,
And if you want to introduce yourself.
For those who don't know me, I'm Terry Harrison. I work with BC Conference as the Property Resource Team Leader. So where you were talking about this idea of being political and how important political is and the sort of energy that powers that, but you need to also have a sense of spirituality and a place where you gather strength from. Here you exert a strength against oppression. Here you gather strength in practice and ritual. And that sort of was where we kind of stopped, and would love to hear more about how.
One other person that you'd like to share something?
Talking about politics.
And can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Jill.
Hi. Politics, what about Stephen Harper? Is nobody mentioning that man's name? Like, you got the power. You got the connection. And yet we're just watching it. Screw our country.
Thank you.
So I don't know.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Great.
The orange signs that were leading us into this room. We wondered if that was a political.
That's political.
Not very subliminal political.
That was, she said, do you want yellow or do you want orange?
Oh, I said orange.
And I said orange.
Subliminal.
Yeah. So, thank everyone for sharing. And, with these pieces, I'm asked to be a guest speaker, but it's really about the wisdom in the room and how we can bring that together as a community. For the second half of the talk, I wanted to speak a little bit more about spirituality and holistic faith communities that are committed to justice. And especially when I start talking about the spirituality stuff, a word of warning. These are ideas that are still emerging for me, so I'm putting them out there to get feedback. They're not necessarily fully refined. But when we talk about this model of kind of committed, faith-based communities that are making change, to me that's the essence of religion. And, I think we can look throughout history and in other traditions to see these deeply spiritual, highly political, very communal groups that were ostracized by the mainstream but continued to do their work regardless. One of the ones people may not be as familiar with is in the Muslim faith. When you look at the history of Prophet Muhammad and how he began his work, his work and his revelations was grounded in speaking out against the injustice and social inequality at the time in the city of Mecca, and the way it was dominated by the Quraysh tribe and all that went along with that. And he organized both men and women, who were his original companions, to challenge the power structures in Mecca, and for that activism he was chased out. And then they fled to Medina, and there the Prophet created a society that had a level of social equality unheard of in the peninsula, that had that had legal protection for religious minorities, that ended tribal justice and blood feuds, that had social supports for the poor, for the widowed and orphaned, and had new legal protections for women that were totally groundbreaking and really upset a lot of men in the community. And they fought during his life to change them, and unfortunately were able to change some of those protections afterwards. But when he was alive and that original community was strong, it was a very inspiring place, and that's the place for Muslims today that they look back to when they think about what it means to be community. And one of the things they talk about is the fact that where Muhammad lived, his home was not a palace, but was also the place for community worship and the place where, when there were new arrivals and travelers, where they would sleep in his house. And contrary, I'll just add, to some of the popular beliefs now, in this community, the hijab was not mandatory for women, was actually only worn by his wives as kind of a special symbol of piety, but certainly was not enforced for anyone else there. But what we see with history is, within a generation, that small, isolated community became an empire across the Middle East. And as it began to take on the logic of an empire, things were very different than that small, ostracized group outside of the fringes of power. Similar story we can see in the Sikh faith, where if you read about Guru Nanak, he created a worldview that was reconciling Hindu and Muslim beliefs, which were a cause of real conflict in India. He created a faith that elevated the status of women and that rejected the caste system, which was creating so much social inequality. And if you wonder why so many Sikh folks have the last name Singh, that was the new last name created that would put aside the old last names which were tied into caste. Despite that, even today, there are still caste divisions in the Sikh community, and patriarchy is still a real reality. And I would argue that this is part of just how religions evolve. They start from dedicated, transformative communities to then becoming the mainstream and taking on a rigid orthodoxy that supports oppression. That's an age-old story, and we can see that within our own faith. We can look at the original Christian communities, and sometimes then I look at, I was talking to Jane about this new television show that someone brought to my attention, which is called Pastors of LA. And it's just about these pastors going around in silk suits with their luxury cars and their beautiful wives and their adventures in Los Angeles. And you think that is almost exactly the type of religious leaders that Jesus was cursing against and turning over tables for. So it's not unique to any other faith, this process. And I think actually, there's something to be learned there. One of my mentors is a man named Barry Reeder. He's an outreach minister in Toronto. And he talks about this idea of energy from the edges. That he believes energy for transformation and justice comes from the edges, from outside of the center and power. It's places like Nazareth, places like the River Jordan, where you have mystics wandering, wearing animal skins and eating locusts. It's places like that where the voice of God, far away from the temple, is heard, and that inspires folks to transformation. But then we see this process where the energy from the edges, within a few generations, becomes taken by the center, codified, frozen, and the mainstream. And then the process begins again, where somewhere from the edges, reformers come up. They do things like walk up to the church steps in Wittenberg and staple 95 Theses of Protest and restart that process of energy from the edges, pushing the center forward. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And hopefully, with each transition, it moves things a little bit better, but sometimes that energy from the edges also pulls the faith of the tradition in the opposite direction. So the question for me now, and I think that might be important to many folks here, is how do we think about that process and that sort of movement today? And of course, it's going to be a challenge. But I think as the church gradually moves from being at the center of Canadian society to be more at the fringes, this is actually creating a space for that energy to emerge. And as I said, this community, won't be one that's just political. Politics alone can be so intellectual and so academic. And I find when I'm in church spaces that are all justice-oriented, that's the direction they always go in. And for me, we need to think about how these new communities engage the whole body. Our hearts, our souls, our two hands for praise, sometimes our feet for dancing. And that, along with the intellectual piece, creates that community for transformation. I could think about two churches I've been to. One was a church called Oasis Church in London, England, when we lived there. And today we go to the Metropolitan Community Church in Toronto. And at both of these congregations, what I love about them is there's a mix of social justice preaching, and ministers will get up there and talk about poverty and progressive issues. But then the worship style, I'll say, is frankly, it's evangelical. You get up, you clap your hands, you raise your hand in the air, you sway to the music. My wife's born in the Caribbean. She loves to dance. She doesn't care what the song is. She'll get up there and dance. And that's just part of the experience of just getting swallowed up by the Spirit and the magnificence of God. And these spaces have taught me a lot. And I'll say, especially that Oasis church we went into in London was full of young people. And it was pretty diverse. And I think that's part of it, that when you mix exciting worship with that social action, you start to build something that's very captivating. But I've also learned about what these new movements look like from other faith groups that I've spent time with. One was when I was doing my activism in university, it ended up that at the heart of the coalition that we formed were a group of young Muslim women who were, the leaders, who were the most involved, who showed up to all the meetings, made things happen. And most wore the hijab. And so as they would say, they were hijabis. It's a kind of term for women who wear the hijab. And that implies a lifestyle, not a fashion choice. And, most of them had been already leaders within Islamic groups or within their own mosques, and they were just naturally taking that to kind of the secular world, because for them, their faith meant working for social justice. And it also, at the time, which was not soon after 9/11, meant really having a very bold symbol that opened them to taunts, to abuse and suspicion. And these were women, for the most part, for all the ones that were involved in the group, who were committed to feminist values and women's rights, even though they were told by society that the choice of what they were wearing was them participating in their own oppression. And they inspired me so much, not just because of that choice, to visually say, no, this is what I want to do for God, and I'm going to do it even if society is going to throw all kinds of stuff in my direction because of that. And I might have values that are different, and I'm going to be proud about that. But also then the discipline and commitment they brought to faith, because that was their lifestyle. That was part of everything they did. And that same discipline, from what they ate to how many times they prayed, was the same thing that came at the meetings, where I knew if I need to assign a task to someone, if there's someone who's actually going to do it, it was some of the sisters who were there, and they got it done. Equally, when I went to South Africa, and a very unexpected experience, my wife and I, through getting involved in grassroots organizing, ended up becoming immersed in the local Rastafarian movement there. And this was a youth movement in the townships, which was basically like a born-again movement for gangsters. And Cape Town is a city, if you know anything about it, where gangs run very deep, to the point that gangs have their own languages, which you learn in jail, which no one else speaks except for members of that gang. And most of the guys I met were part of it, and it tended to be mainly a male movement, Rastafari. But for most of them, they came at it, and it was a turning point in their life. It was where they said, you know what, I can go in this direction, but I want to do something else, and I want to leave this lifestyle behind me. So for them, it said, I'm going to grow my hair, which is going to open me up to police harassment and stereotypes, but I'm going to do it. It meant I'm going to become vegan, even in South Africa, which is a big culture about eating meat, and the braai and barbecue is so big. I'm going to become vegan. It meant I was going to read and exercise every day. It meant turning your back on consumerism. It meant giving up cigarettes and alcohol. And for those young men who were so-called colored, it meant giving up the apartheid categories and saying, no, I am African. My roots are actually in the indigenous Khoi or San people that are here. And I'm actually a black person, and I'm proud of it. And I'm not going to have any of this separation from the past. And Lisa and I were amazed that when we went into the townships, into the informal settlements, in Cape Town at least, it was the Rastas who were building the daycares, who were doing the community cookouts, who were mentoring youth, who were teaching young people about indigenous heritage. I had a friend, his name we knew him was Bradlocks, and he actually went to Midia, learned Khoi, and then was teaching Khoi to young so-called colored kids in the townships so they could reconnect, and he was showing them how to build bow and arrows and all these pieces that were totally disconnected from the youth there, and that was all within this community. Even when I started working and how I got connected to the community, I was helping out Surplus Peoples Project, which is an organization supported by the UCC that's a land reform organization. And it just so happened that my manager, that one of the other senior managers, that their legal advisor, and the filmmakers working there were all Rasta. And so that was a community that was so connected to politics. It was also a community that was very connected to nature, which we loved. These were guys who would take us into the mountains to find the waterfall. People didn't know because that was a core part of their spiritual practice, was to love creation. And it was seeing a faith that was part of people's entire lives, not just something they did on Sundays. And I'll give one example. This is one of my favorite stories. So I went to Johannesburg and was staying with some comrades of our friends from Cape Town. And I got there and it was Earth Day. And I was with my friends Boogie and Vusi, and they're two filmmakers. And I came in and I said, oh, it's Earth Day, or it was Earth Hour. We have to turn off the power for an hour. That's what everyone's doing in Canada. And they kind of smirked and they said, sure, whatever, man, let's do it. And then I realized that they held Sabbath every Saturday, where they didn't drink water, they didn't eat food, and they used no electricity. Every week. And these were filmmakers. And they were literally kind of starving artists. And one day every week, they weren't able to do any of their profession because for God, they wanted to practice this self-discipline and giving up. And just like, the Muslim women I saw before, who weren't prudes, who weren't super conservative, despite, some of the perceptions, but said, for God, I want to make a sacrifice, and things like dating, I'm just not going to do, because I believe that's the way I can show my dedication to a higher power. Two very different communities, but both of these experiences showed me a little bit of a glimpse of what those early religious movements might have looked like, where you mixed politics and social change with a religious lifestyle that was counterculture, that was different. And I didn't become Muslim, I didn't become Rasta, but it was beautiful to journey with these folks. And I remember when I would go downtown, from the town, when we'd go downtown with my friend Benji, who was my best friend in South Africa, who was Rasta, and we'd walk through the streets, and every working class person we'd well, not every, but many who we would go past, whether they were a parking guard or a store clerk or a cleaner, they would see him come up and just give him fist taps. Just because they knew, because of the dreads, that he was about something positive and doing work in community. And one of my sister's best friends came, and she's evangelical Christian, and hung out with us. And she came to me one day and she said, "My God, Kofi, could you imagine if Christians had this image? If someone could see you wearing a cross and they would just come up to the street and shake your hand because they knew that your faith meant you were doing great things in community? Wouldn't that be amazing?" And I believe it can happen. But it will take work. And one thing for us in the UCC is we start needing to think about how we put our values into our entire lifestyles and our rituals. To not separate political or social actions from what we eat, what we drink, what we buy, what we wear, how we are present in the world. And here's one tiny example. One thing I loved was when the United Church took a stance against bottled water in the mid-2000s. Now, I admit, I've kind of fallen off the horse, or fallen off the wagon. I'm not as good as I used to be. But in 2006, man, I was really into it. Part of it was I was at church house, so I was surrounded by a community that was also really into it. And I remember the pride I would have when I would show up at a meeting with my water bottle and say, "Oh, can I fill up from the tap?" And they'd say, "Why?" And I'd say, "Well, actually, my church has made a stance against bottled water. We believe part of taking care of the environment is not using it." And that would start amazing conversations, and it would also really inspire people around. Small example, but I think that's a great example of the kind of ways we can put our faith and our politics into our daily lives. It's not something you have to be an activist at the front line to do. It's something anyone who is a member can take on. Another practice, and this is something that hasn't happened, but when we're thinking about how do we make statements together as community, one thing I've always mused about was around Christmas. I really hate the commodification of Christmas. I don't know if anyone else does, but it makes me totally sick. And I've always wondered, what if there was a United Church congregation that together said, for this Christmas, we're not buying presents. No one, not even for the kids. As a congregation, we're going to make a statement against consumerism and say that we're simply going to take that portion of our income and put it towards good works, and we're going to do Christmas events, but they're all going to be towards kind of world peace and justice. When I have this thought experiment, I imagine that congregation would be on the news, for sure. The church that gave up Christmas, it would be there. But also, what an amazing statement it would make about people who are saying, we don't like how things are going in the mainstream, we want to do it differently, and it's rooted in our faith. And that happens actually in my family, maybe some of your families. We don't give gifts to adults anymore. People will just give gifts to charity in their name. But I wish it could be part of a larger, more spiritual practice, and I think that'd be a perfect example. And these are the times when you do those actions together that build that solidarity. When you read reports from people who are part of the bus boycotts and the civil rights movement, and talking about it was really tough, but people had to work together to drive their own cars as taxis and to man the phones as dispatchers, and then every night they came together and worshiped. I hear from my Muslim friends when they talk about Ramadan and how that brings the community together because everyone's fasting together, and many times you're together at the mosque. Funny story, my friend Hashi from the UK was the only, of 4,000 students, the only Somali British student at Oxford. It tells you something about diversity there. And he always talks about this joke about Ramadan, that he has his favorite store in the Somali area of northwest London. And he said, one Ramadan, for 3 weeks straight, there was a 20-pound note on the table with a note beside it saying, someone dropped it, please pick it up if it's yours. And for that holy month, no one picked it up. And he said, Kofi, any other time during the year, that would have lasted 30 seconds. But because it was a holy month and we were there as a community, no one touched it because people wanted to kind of follow those values at that time. And so I think about how do we do that within our own church? And one of the things I think about is Lent. Do people here do that practice of giving something up for Lent? Yeah, I think that's a great practice that we need to bring more to the heart of what we do in our church. I picked that up because when I was in my church, it wasn't something in the wider church, but our youth group did it. And so every Lent, we talked about what we were giving up, and we supported each other in that process. It used to be things like TV or snack food, but it was a great way to actually practice spiritual discipline together and support ourselves through it. And when I lived in university, my roommate and I, we would always do that every year. And we would challenge each other on something difficult, and we would just follow up. And, we weren't, our apartment wasn't like a super religious zone, but for Lent, we were really practicing every day our values. And to me, that's where we need to move to, these spiritual practices that can involve all of us instead of the practice of giving money. Because for me, not that it's bad, but I think in many cases, the UCC has fallen into the trap of the way to get involved in justice is to give money. And I think for all mainline churches, we've gotten this habit of disconnecting the justice work from the congregation work. And we pay experts, whether at conference office or church house or very well-educated ministers, those are the experts that do the justice work. And they do great stuff, and they're amazing people. They do advocacy, they send money overseas, they campaign for government. But the problem is, it's not connected to your everyday Sunday, beyond just raising money for M&S. And the average churchgoer, it's a very consumer relationship. They're basically the ones that write the check, and they outsource it to somebody else. And this is a two-way process, because I studied this in my PhD thesis. And I talked to a lot of those anti-apartheid activists. And they admitted, they thought the congregations in the church at the time, in the 70s and 80s, were too conservative and too misinformed about what was happening in South Africa to really be part of it. So they formed their own national or local networks. They got some money through church circles, and they just did their work on their own in isolation. And they said, it's great to do popular education, sure, we'll do that, but at the end of the day, we're just going to go do it over here in our own circle. And it was great. They created amazing campaigns, and they did a lot of work. And it was the more efficient way to do it. It was quicker than doing the education and bringing people on board. But it also meant the church as a whole became less invested in the work. And that has consequences. I think in all churches, the rise, and in all nonprofit work, the rise of professional people who do development as an occupation, whereas 2 or 3 generations before it was volunteers who did it, has had real consequences. And so when my friends who are church activists say, oh my gosh, the justice work is being cut at Church House, or Kairos is being attacked by the conservatives. Oh, the lady isn't there, but oh, there she is. The conservatives are going after Kairos. I say, oh, that's bad news. But even worse is that it's not so upsetting in local congregations. And it should upset them. But it doesn't, because people are disconnected from the work. Because we've turned it into something that happens over there where we have worship and kind of, our other pastoral care and other great activities here. I think even of Barry Reeder, the mentor I mentioned. He's an amazing man who's done outreach work in the Jane Finch community for almost 2 decades. And he does all kinds of stuff in a very challenging social housing community. He does programming. He gives out school bags to every kid in the building when school starts, filled with supplies. He mediates conflicts between residents. Like, he'll actually get there in intertribal Somali conflicts and be there between each side as a neutral arbitrator. He's built memorials in community for youth who've been victims of gun violence. He does pastoral care work to families. He's helped create community space. It's amazing. It's an inspiring story of the United Church doing social justice work. But it's also a lonely story, because he does it on his own. He's not connected to any congregation in Toronto. Congregations really just interact to send money. He goes and does his talk at wherever, Forest Hill United or this church and that, and people give money to it, but there isn't real interaction. And very few people who support his ministry have ever been to Jane Finch, or have ever, made interactions with the kind of working class new immigrant folks that he works with every day. And this is an issue. To me, this is the opposite of inspired communities of action that I've spoken about before. So we need, I truly believe, to make justice work part of spiritual practices that are accessible for everyone. Not everyone's going to do it in the same way, but we've got to find ways that are more accessible. The other is connecting the dots between renewed, passionate faith and our actions. As Scripture says, we need the faith and the acts. And this again goes, to thinking about what inspiration means for the long road. And I know that for me, I can only do the work I do because it's so deeply connected to my faith and spirituality. Recently we did an exercise at the office where I had a paint party with my team. And so we all came in, and we had 30 minutes. We put on some Bob Marley and conscious reggae, and everyone got a big canvas, and we just painted. People, it's a lot better than just doing work. But more so, we painted about our why. Everyone had to paint, what is the reason that you are actually here and doing this work? And so it's an activity I'd recommend for you folks who are in teams. It's a great thing to do. And when I painted my why, I did a very crude drawing of the earth with kind of people holding hands around it and a kind of roof. And I said to folks, this is my view of kind of this idea of the dominion of God. And to me, this is what drives my work, being a part of that, being one of those people, both in the present, with the ancestors, with the people to come, who are working to build that kingdom. And I also got to spend a little bit of time talking to them about my own spiritual practice. And that, or what I've been trying to do, is an idea of what I call karma yoga for Jesus. Now, karma yoga is a Hindu practice. It was what was used by Gandhi and many others. And it basically means detached action. And it's the main practice that's outlined in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a dialogue between Krishna, who's an incarnation of God, with Arjuna, where he basically tells him the meaning of life as they're sitting in this chariot before a battle. And basically, karma yoga works roughly like this. Any situation, you identify your dharma, or your duty. And you ask yourself, what is my duty here? And then you act, but you work to act as an instrument of God, realizing that you have no personal responsibility for the results of your actions. You totally give up that feeling of attachment and ego from the results. So if it succeeds or it fails, doesn't matter. You keep telling yourself, I'm just doing this as an instrument. As long as I'm doing what my dharma requires and doing it with honest intentions, that's all that's mattered. And it's a hard spiritual path. The idea is if you do it properly, you can reach enlightenment without having to run off to the bush and just separate yourself from society. You can be like a monk acting in the world. I'm certainly a long way off from that. But it is a practice that's had some great results in my own life. I started it when I was 19 and got a job running the youth outreach program at Air Mills United Church. It was an amazing job, but it was so stressful that within a month, I just had all the skin peel off of the inside of my hands. I was just so stressed out about the responsibility. And around that time, I read the Bhagavad Gita, started thinking about karma yoga, and started to try to train my mind to let go of connection to the fruits of my actions, to practice that detachment, to just say, I'm a disciple of Jesus. What would Jesus want me to do as a disciple? I'm going to do that with good intentions and try to take the ego out. And, I do this as an individual, and it's worked well, but I wish that that was the sort of practice that I'd found out about within a congregation. And I think if many young people found those sort of deeper spiritual disciplines in congregations, they'd probably continue to be much more active in their adult life. And, I've found practices like that in the United Church, but more often than not, there are places like this. They were at retreats, they were at conferences, there are places outside of the daily Sunday. And I wish that these spiritual searching and these spiritual disciplines were things that you'd find on Sunday morning. Because what I see with a lot of young people now is they're doing this, they're building these spiritual practices, but they're doing it in isolation, by themselves. And that's why I get so excited whenever I meet someone of any faith who's actually actively practicing their faith and connecting it to justice. And those are just great conversations, because we kind of latch on to each other like, oh, I finally have someone to talk to about this, who actually wants to hear it. And so I feel humbly that this must be our focus. That if people love justice in this church, it's not just about educating people politically about issues, but also about educating them spiritually on how to grow in their justice work. And again, we can look to our past traditions. And I think one that has a lot of relevance today is our Christian mystic traditions. And that's, at least for me, and I'll be totally biased, my own spiritual path has really taken me to a lot of mystic and Eastern ideas. And, mystic traditions all over the world hold one common theme: the oneness of reality. That God is everywhere, that it's because of our ego and our desires and all the clutter from our senses that we see the world in duality, where in reality, God is within all of us, part of everything, every rock, every tree, every star, every animal. We're all part of a larger unity. And that is a perspective I know many young people in my generation are drawn to, because it seems to make a lot more sense than a quasi-human God that's there but just bigger than us. And as the modern mystic Eckhart Tolle, and I know he lives in Vancouver, or this area, and lives in Kelowna, talks about, it's this idea of God as the unmanifest, that God is the source. God is the infinite potential that of all that exists or can exist, but that this is God that's beyond the world of objects. One of the great things Tolle says is, how ridiculous is it to say, oh, there's Jane over there, there's the chair over there, and there's God here. Like, God in the world of objects just doesn't make sense, because this is the infinite. You can't just say, like,
here's this, here's God. No, it's beyond that. And so thinking of God as that source of creation, that womb of the universe, that place where all great ideas and inspiration come from, that place where those perfect forms that Aristotle talk about dwell, that place, where when we see the goodness in a child's laugh, or we see the goodness in any deed, that is that goodness that reflects God, that is at the heart of every human being, that we're all part of that, but we are not God, for God is more than the sum of all parts of the entire manifest world. Now, these ideas, are almost fully impossible to comprehend intellectually. And that's at the heart of mysticism, that you can never understand these ideas through reason, that it's beyond reason, that you can only know it through experience. And so that's why you have practices like meditation and mindfulness, which are about slowing your thinking, slowing your intellect, trying to find that stillness and find that part of the infinite within you. It's trying not to overthink, but be fully present in the world, and suddenly you start seeing God in it, in everything around you, and ultimately in yourself. As the Sufi mystic Rumi said, you realize that you are not one drop in the ocean, but the entire ocean in one drop. Anyways, I'm going to stop here because I can get really excited and go on all day about fusing, mystic and Eastern traditions and Christian theology. And hey, I'm definitely no guru. I'm very far from experiencing the infinite. But my only point is to say that for me, I've had to connect my work in activism to this sort of deeper spiritual reflection and practice. And I've realized that the only thing you really control is yourself. The rest is beyond you. But by putting your consciousness in the right place, you have the best chance of being able to be a force of good in the world. That by acknowledging your interconnectedness with all people and creation, doing good just becomes a natural response. And that, for me, in this present day, has made me a lot more stressed out because I've mixed that kind of mental practice with some passionate worship at Metropolitan Community Church, and it's kept me pretty grounded in some really difficult times. And this, then, I think, is the mission for the church, to help people to be inspired to act, but also help them to find deeper spiritual practices and understanding that are inspired and engaged. And while we can do this individually, it's best if we do it in community. Because as I said before, and as Jim said, remember, hope lives in community. And of course, there are many paths to this understanding or feeling of God, and we need to be open and try to experiment with it. Now, I want to give one final kind of piece to leave you with. And as a warning, as I said before, I'm no guru, I'm no expert in spiritual practices. I'm just someone who, through my own reading and talking with my wife and other spiritual friends around me, is on this journey. I'm a fellow searcher. But there are a few things that I've at least come to at this point that I think should be at the heart of these spiritual practices that are already there, but we can make even more explicit in what we do in church. So there's two elements to this spirituality that I think leads to action. The first is empathy. One thing we all have in common in the room today is that we're all believers in the goodness of humanity. While many will see us just as being smart animals or as really powerful organic computers, as people of faith, we believe in the inherent goodness that we all have. We believe in that divine spark in us, that inherent dignity that comes from being children of God. But despite that essence, we live in human bodies, which were created by evolution and are ultimately a little flawed in a few places. One place we're really flawed at is around empathy. Our poor brains just seem to be wired to always create us versus them. That was a survival mechanism. And our brains are so focused on ego and survival that we kind of block out things like that inherent connection that we all have. And so we really have to train our brains. We have to undo that natural wiring by opening up our hearts and our souls to truly recognize the goodness in others. And it's hard. Some people do a really good job at hiding that goodness inside of them. Still, we have to remember what Jesus said, that in that person who is thirsty or hungry or homeless, that person hurting or in need, in them, he is there. So first, before politics, before activism, I think we have to cultivate in our spirituality that greater empathy for others. The second pillar I'm starting to understand that must be a cornerstone of a spirituality for action is creativity. I love being creative. I love writing. I love coming up with stories. I like taking photos. And I don't know, for other folks who do very creative things, I find it's just amazing. That time when you're on a roll and the inspiration is just channeling through you and you're just making stuff and it just seems to be emerging? well, to me, there's no better way to directly talk about connecting to the unmanifest than when you get into that creative zone and you're just creating and bringing forth ideas. And so for me, a spirituality to inspire must be based in creativity, through fostering new expression, through playfulness, through creating, through fostering a community that takes time to create. That's a place that also helps people to build that connection to the divine, and is also a replenishing community. And we're going to do that this afternoon when you take time to create art as a community. And if you follow me for a moment, what I believe is when you bring together that empathy with that creativity, you get love. To me, that's the basis of love, and I see that in my daughter. She's 11 months old, and it's really true, that idea that with each month that passes, I love her even more. I can feel that empathy extending. I can feel our connection growing in my heart. But there's also a creativity to there, a dynamic creative part to that love. Because it's always finding new ways to make her laugh, playing with her to find new games, finding new ways to teach her. I see that love has a dynamic and creative element at the heart of it. And so this means in our congregations that the spiritual practices, the worships, the ones that embody love best, will always think about empathy, always thinking about increasing our inclusion, increasing that who is our neighbor to encompass more and more folks. But it should also be daring, creative, and playful. And that kind of spirituality, one based on love, naturally leads to justice. For as Dr. Cornel West says, justice is love in action. So if we have a faith rooted in love, then when we turn that faith into action, it should naturally manifest as justice work. So to sum up, a community that inspires to act must be holistic in its approach to faith, must be deeply spiritually engaged, as deep as it is politically, and should try to make empathy and creativity at the heart of its ongoing practices. So again, I've given a little food for thought. We're going to take 10 minutes to discuss, and then we're going to come back. I had a couple closing words, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the question I have for you, before you might have some questions for me, is what does your spiritual practice look like? Talk about that. And how do they inspire you to action? So let's share again some of the wisdom in the room. We're going to take 10 minutes.
What we try to do is inspire them. We don't have roots in faith. We need to look in our community. On Saturday
Long for it, just like I want that discipline. And so it's been a give and take for me. Like I think I went through periods where, trying to have, okay, this is my daily practice, and then eventually fall the wagon, and I beat myself up about that. So I've been to a place where I generally don't beat myself up about it, and allow my practices to be evolving, consistencies to my practices, but then still wanting to push back with some specific like what. So what's that tension of some discipline and some give and take, so that I'm not, so the I think the most important discipline, which I just figuring out, my Sabbath practice, or at least setting aside my Sabbath day, how I practice that Sunday, what that looks like, is a flow, and I just feel like gradually things just start to, it's unusual, but that Sabbath day resets purpose, and that whole day is just focused on resting in God's love. Like the whole day for that is just so it's gone on in the rest of the week, and so that's big. And that's
But anyway, so when I went to university, I was standing on the campus. The very first time I did it, I started, choose to eat popcorn, you still got to sit and I go,
Boy, that was, when we talked
We've had that conversation.
but by the time we got
I mean, that does work. It is something you do.
For my wife, that's very essential because
I'm just that creativity because it's great. I mean, I have to do something for this. Giving us the conference. It's just that clean.
It's a lot easier for people. Someone can speak about First Nations.
Yeah, really.
But don't have any real meaningful relationship.
those are writing papers and last minute like.
No, it's mine.
It's
It's still,
Actually, it was
it's still a
interesting
disconnect.
because
So I don't part of what
back kind of,
I
I think it's the one who translated everything that back in that time. She's so well planned ahead.
They do like a dinner. Invite anyone.
I got it up because
And
we
they
had
just serve, you get a lot of people and go down on their luck and mental health. Or you'll just get some folks who want to meet folks. And then you just sit around at the table. And eat together. Yeah, I mean, you've got a major food and then you come out. And that's the only place that you can really have. And I think that had so much in Toronto. We're very happy to talk about two cities now, with downtown, prosperous places in the world. Where you just are cranes anywhere but high, and and it's so great and cultural and trendy. And then the inner suburbs, which are
Just gonna flow.
where some of the lots of poverty and totally disconnected. So you get lots of great progressive folks downtown. I care about poverty. I just don't have any connection to the community. Yeah, and I don't really want to go there. And I said, oh, I don't want to go to school. Like, it's out of the way. It's out of the way. I'm like, well, that's part of why it's isolated, because it is out of the way. But by going there, and that's what people ask me why it's been you want me to all the people on the outside of the city get him, because he said, I hate these journeys downtown. I hate all this gate riding, bike riding, and all that stuff. It does nothing for you who are living in poverty.
No,
And you just go.
no, because that's what
I think for me in the public housing complexes, with those young small guys with arm around them, with their mothers, just there, shaking people's hands and helping them out, giving free clinics.
But it's
Totally reprehensible man, but he understood in relationships much better.
Beth and these people that you everything.
One of the things that Fraser started with
and it's not This is our opportunity to everyone close to the church. And in the justice of all of this stuff. And our other space eventually because but fact is, this is our opportunity. Minister to our community. These are not but it's also
feel very dehumanized by the fact. So is it just to say, yeah, there may be someone there who knows to do drywall, he's raised creatively, and that's, no one likes being given a handout. Very embarrassing.
it's just because that's what we do. And then to our you just do it.
like we put together this kind of set with stuff part, like the house, so now sorry, I did interrupt you. I just, you end up focusing on negative views and get out of that. Well, and then like Mother Teresa, that kind of the one that kept the candles of the farm, don't you, and now we have a farm.
Yes.
And the tree are
Set the temperature. You want to set the direction. It's almost like
You know exactly what's happening inside my You gave really hard, it would be good to collaborate.
Okay, friends.
But I mean, this connection's important.
Again, I have to be the bad guy.
yes, or we know why you go there. It's not that you're
Recenter, sorry. So, again, I'm just going to ask if there's one or two people who want to share something inspiring or interesting that came up in the community, please. Close and then have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I don't want to eat too much into people's lunches, but we could also continue that when we get back. But any real jewels people want to share with the larger system? Oh.
a real jewel.
Lori.
Yeah. We were talking.
Stand up, please.
Okay.
And if you don't mind introducing yourself.
I'm
So it seems like most people know each other.
Lori Benjamin, totally out of the church. We were talking about your suggestion that we develop creativity in the congregation, and you suggested that we do that through worship. And we talked about how we, when we're creating worship, we actually often do that creatively, but it's still an opportunity for people to respond and not necessarily create themselves. So we had an engaging conversation about how we actually get to a place where the congregation members are actually creating versus just responding to something we've created. So we didn't come to any great big answers, but it's a different thing.
That's a great point. I think in my parents' church, my mom has talked about they do they now have a Black History Month service and they have an Asian Heritage service. And those have been places, my mom's from the Caribbean, that in both cases, because the leadership is not from those backgrounds, it becomes lay members who come together and design the services. And she's talked about this little community that's created around those services where people who would never have been in leadership roles get to take that on and get to create. And it also brings in folks who are in more of a minority in the congregation to actually share their histories. And they've become rather inspiring, where a lot of them, those Heritage Month services are for people to give their personal stories. And it kind of really shot, I remember one of the gentlemen talked about his parents' experience as Japanese Canadians being interned during this, or his grandparents, and what that meant for the family, and that kind of stuff. People just had no idea, but the way when,
the minister there, and kudos to her, kind of gave up that control. Some really amazing stuff has happened. Yes.
Great study, and it's we had a bit of a conversation around the language. Many of us are born into the United Church, and you do all of this stuff that you do, and we don't always have the right language. And we had an opportunity in our congregation where we had a fire close to the congregation, and they used our church as the collection point for all of the stuff because we were close, we had space, and Dave over there took a strong lead in doing that. But when I'm talking about the language, what he said was that this was our opportunity to minister to our neighborhood. And for me, as born and brought up in the United Church, it was the right thing to do, but to have that language around it, like that's the thing that really super resonated with me, is that we don't always have those opportunities. And what was great was that Dave was there and took that opportunity. The congregation rallied around. We get volunteers and we get piles of crap in our, not crap, but stuff in our worship space.
A lot of crap.
That's the only worship space. That's the only space. We don't have auditoriums. That was our worship space, and boxes and boxes of stuff. But it was the language and positioning it in that thing, and it's so much stuff we do just because we do, and to get that theological, spiritual side of it too was really meaningful for me.
Thank you. And it's also amazing how those times of crisis open up creativity, because you're forced to break habits and do things differently, and that tends to be when so much growth happens. Go ahead, please.
And the interesting thing in our discussion, none of us identified our practices on Sunday morning as part of our spiritual practices.
Yes.
We actually talked about how that's not part of our spiritual practices and why, and we all had examples of other things, from putting...
We keep doing it. If so many folks keep talking about it, that it's just not there, but we have the resources and people are doing it outside of the church. What is it? And I think maybe that's worth thinking about. Just to close. So thank you for this. And thank you for sharing, everyone. I want to say, my friends, we live in a world that needs us. There's no more powerful force for transformation in the world than motivated religious communities. That mixture of spiritual practice and a collective identity centered on building a new world is unstoppable, and history shows that. So I invite you over this event to go deep in conversation, in sessions, to tap into that God-given creativity you have and think about what is holding back your congregations. Think of the new ways you can be a catalyst there for building an even more engaged community for transformation. And also, as we listen to the panel tomorrow and hear from others, always be open to expanding your circle, to pushing the envelope of your own personal empathy. The world needs you. With the violence, the inequality, the climate disaster out there, we need change. We need maladjusted, progressive Christians that are not afraid to take a stand. The world needs a revitalized and growing united church. The world needs us. Not as saviors, not as heroes, but as allies with others and with God in this great, glorious mission we have been given by Jesus to build God's dominion on earth. As the Lord said or announced when he began his mission, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." These are the words of the one we follow. This was the mission that he announced and he was on. And now we, the body of Christ, we have been called to continue this mission of justice. Let us embrace it joyfully, humbly, but more importantly, together in community. Praise be to God.
Riveting. I can't even add anything else to that because he did such a beautiful summary. And my son just went, whoa. This afternoon, we're going to be creating, and we're going to focus on process, not outcome, although some of the outcome looks kind of amazing already. I don't even know how they got those things up here. But what I'm taking out specifically around the action part, right, is we're going to be fully present. We're going to express empathy. We're going to add creativity for new expression and for replenishing. And then I've got in my notes, and that equals love. And I can't wait for that. So let's have some empathy, some inclusion, and some daring creative times this afternoon.
What time?
Yes. Queen, right when we get back. Great. So as you're away for your little lunches, think about some of the themes that were teased out this morning. Think about questions you might have. We're going to have a little bit of discussion to set us up for creating this afternoon.
1:45?
Sure, 1:45, Doug? Sounds good?
Yeah, because it'll
Yeah,
take a while for people to get lunch.
Yeah, we'll see you back here ready to go at 1:45.
Just before you go,
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
a word from Claire. You were given some homework to do. It's okay if you didn't do it, it was on the email that went out. But as part of the creative process this afternoon, she wants you to come with a vision or an image or a symbol that energizes or inspires you. So I'm hoping that you take 2 seconds over lunch. Think about some kind of symbol or image that inspires you. Now, some of us have come with pictures and of that. If you did not, when you come back, there will be a box of pictures. But she would like you to come with the symbol first and then pick the picture, as opposed to going through the pictures and trying to find the symbol. So if you just
It energizes you, gives you hope.
yeah, energizes and inspires you, yes. So, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
So we'll see you later.
Enjoy lunch. Yeah.
See you later.
Spiritual practices.